Welcome. My name is Patrick Cohn. I'm the Managing Director for Fisheries R&D Corporation. It's my pleasure to facilitate this session, and it's going to be very short and sharp in my role. So there's the most opportunity to hear both from our speakers and also to have the panel discussion. In setting up this session, AB has challenged us to be disruptive, really challenge the policy framework that we've got at a federal and state level to truly think through this complex problem around climate. So that's what the speakers have been asked to do. I'd just like to acknowledge the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people whose land we're meeting on today, pay my respects to their elders past and present, and acknowledge the amazing work that they do in oceans, rivers, streams. I'm not going to mention the land, because we're the wet people. So first of all, I'd like to introduce Greta Pretzel. Without the R, but yeah. Petzel, I'm getting it better. I've just learnt that I've been pronouncing her name wrong all these years. Greta is going to come and talk to you about her work in this area of marine fisheries and climate change. Greta is the Director of Centre for Marine Sociology, Institute for Marine and Antarctic Studies, University of Tasmania. All over to you, Greta.
Okay, thanks for that introduction, Patrick, and for the invitation to speak today. So we are talking about fisheries, but I thought I'd start off talking about the ocean itself. This graph here shows an annual sea surface temperature averaged across the globe. Each one of those blue lines there is a year from 1982. The yellow line is the year from is last year, and that red line right at the top, sitting wildly above all those other observations, is the average temperature in the ocean at the moment. It's estimated to be warmer right now than it has in at least 100,000 years. The update that I saw this morning, the little red line goes straight up. It's not even on an angle. So literally every climate scientist or ocean scientist I know is quite surprised by the temperatures that we're seeing at the moment. So I just wanted to reiterate that we are outside of the status quo. And on top of that, we have, at a global level, escalating biodiversity loss. We're not meeting most of our SDGs. We're blasting through planetary boundaries. This is a cheery way to start the morning, isn't it? Limiting warming to 1.5 or even 2 degrees looks extremely unlikely. Things like ocean acidification. The ocean's 30% more acidic now than it was pre-industrial times. And the sea ice that was missing from Antarctica this year, the extent of that sea ice, or last year, was about the size of Western Australia. And we all know how large that is. And then there's evidence that tipping points in the climate system or in terms of impacts are already being met. And it breaks my heart to say it, but the Great Barrier Reef looks like it's one of those. That was one of the parts of the IPCC report that I was responsible for drafting in the last report. So it goes without saying that there's quite a few changes for fisheries. So just about all of those things that we heard about yesterday, so Sharon Harvey's talk, for example, on wine, just about all of those things throughout the supply chain also apply to seafood production, except we can't see what we're dealing with most of the time, and we don't have any control of any of the inputs as well. So it's quite a complex system. Like other ag sectors, there's new diseases, viruses, toxins. They seem to be cropping up faster in the marine environment in response to heat waves than they do on land. And just to make it extra spicy, we've got about 50% of our species already undertaking large changes in distribution. That's a value that applies to land and the ocean, but these changes are happening much faster in the ocean, up to 10 times faster in the ocean than they are on land. So we have some considerable challenges. And then we have around half of the habitats around our coastline that many of our fisheries species are dependent on already having very significant climate impacts. So corals, kelps, seagrass, mangroves. We've lost 95% of the giant kelp from Tasmania. Lots of other statistics there I could reel off, but we don't have time. So big fundamental changes in where the stocks are, what they look like, sizes of species, compositions of ecosystems, structure, function. The whole thing is completely changing. There needs to be some very significant changes, but there are some massive barriers to that. We have a range of technological, ecological, societal barriers, but it's those institutional barriers that really are that biggest challenge in terms of adapting. So in many cases, there is a fundamental, recognition that the circumstances have clearly changed, but sometimes there isn't in terms of management. We don't have the same baselines. The timing of our impacts are highly uncertain. A lot of our models to do stock assessment depended on, assumptions of stability, which have just gone right out the window. And current management really just isn't set up to manage these, but in many cases there isn't really, I've got feasible, but perhaps the word there is palatable, alternative approach. And managers often just don't have the agency to make the changes that would make sense. So management is so inflexible, which has, resulted in stock assessment and management in Australia that's world recognised as being, best that you can do, but don't really apply under a changing climate. So lots of our conditions are changing. And in fact, when we're trying to deal with impacts and adaptation and with the industry, they'll say, oh, we'll rock up to your workshop, but management won't make any change. So they're finding that very frustrating, and it's a barrier to getting engagement. I do think there is a case or cause for very cautious optimism in terms of fisheries in Australia and climate change. The fact that seafood has such a low carbon footprint compared to other protein sources, I think is fantastic for market access, price point, all those sustainability credentials that I think could really set us up well. There's a whole range of other reasons there for optimism. Seafood producers are inherently adaptive and responsive. I've got the plus minus there though, because there are one of our studies showing that a lot of the changes that industry are doing in response are not necessarily productive, and in some cases they run counter to what the planned management responses are, and we don't record those. So we need to have mechanisms for understanding what the industry are already doing so that we can make sure we're working in concert. What else have I got there? We've got a large suite of tools that are, ready to apply. We've got more or less like a stock take of what kind of information we've got and what kind of management preparedness there is for our top 100 commercial species. Bad news there is that there are big gaps, but at least we know kind of where we're starting from. And one big advantage, I think, is that we've had historically as a sector a really big focus on two-way communication, learning and exchange, and building on that trust and those processes. We're developing and co-developing and working on a project at the moment that FRDC's just contributed to, really trying to create better mechanisms for industry, management and the research sector to have a more reflexive relationship, generate more trust and really understand what those climate issues and responses might be. And a bit complex to go through in 5 minutes, but I would love to chat to anybody here that would like to learn more about that, and in particular how that could be a potential model for other ag sectors as well. But I think in this environment of constant change, that building of trust between those different sectors that need to respond and communication and engagement is really critical, not just as one-off processes or one-off things at the end of projects, but really we need to work on what are those mechanisms that will really set us up for responding to massive changes in the next 10 years. And that's all that I had. Thank you.
Just a quick reminder, there's an online conference app. There's a Q&A you can go in. I know some people are already putting their questions and answers. Just a reminder, if you'd like to start putting your questions and answers, because we will have a panel session at the end. Moving quickly, now introduce Wes Norris, who's the CEO of the Australian Fisheries Management Authority, and will acknowledge that this handbook that was just put up was co-funded with AFMA, which is probably one of the most influential documents that we've done, at least in the last decade. So, all yours, Wes.
Right, thanks very much, Patrick, and g'day everybody, and thank you to ABARES for the invitation to participate in this discussion as well. So I'm the Chief Executive Officer of the Australian Fisheries Management Authority. I'm going to rip through a fairly quick presentation on sort of the journey that we've been on over the last couple of years in relation to climate change, and then leave you with a couple of sort of open-ended questions around how policy, some policy challenges that we face in moving forward. So do I change this? Oh, there we go. Sorry. So where are we at? Over the last couple of years, we've been through what I've come to term our discovery phase. As always with management, we're late to the party, and so all of those terrifying trends that Greta just talked about, which are evident in terms of data that's coming through. It takes a little lag before that turns into direct impacts on fisheries, and then takes a little lag before governments can mobilise and do something about it, which is very sad. So we've been through the phase about what do we know, what do we understand about the way that climate change, that changing environmental conditions are impacting things. We're in an adaptation phase at the moment, so how do we change the way that we're actually doing our business? So we've got this basic understanding now. What do we do different in terms of our decision making? What do we do in terms of our changes to the way that we monitor and assess fish stocks and respond to whatever comes out of that? And then equally as important, there needs to be a policy reform phase. We need to be able to ask the question about, is our whole basis for the way that we manage fisheries actually fit for purpose in the way the way that the environment's going to work into the future? So next one, please. So the discovery phase. This is all about collating a huge body of information that's out there and putting it into the context of different fisheries that we manage and different stocks. And trying to understand what that then means for the fishing industry, because fisheries management is all about managing people rather than managing fish. So trying to understand the practical consequences. So these are examples of climate and ecosystem report cards. So all of our fishery resource assessment groups, which are our science advisors, and our management advisory committees, which provide advice to me as the CEO and to the AFMA Commission, are now working on things like this. So it's an attempt to collate everything that we know that might have an impact on the way that the fishery is going to operate, either right now or looking into the future, so that we can start making climate-ready decisions. What that discovery, next slide please, what that discovery phase has allowed or contributed to is a series of new modelling that's really interesting, and this is work we've done primarily with CSIRO, or CSIRO has done for us. Can I have the next slide, please? Some of you will have seen this. It's a really exciting new paper that's been published recently by Beth Fulton and some staff from AFBA. And essentially what it does is have a look at using modelling, and I think the authors would always be the first to admit that it's a model only. But what is the status of stocks as we understand it now? What do we think it would be if there wasn't a climate change signal in the marine environment that those stocks operate within? And I won't spend too much time going through it, although I could. But essentially, any of these boxes that are outlined in red are species that are particularly sensitive to a changing climate. And so you see for some of them, there's a very big difference between the two lines. And so if you have a look at Eastern Morwong, for example, it suggests that in the absence of climate change, that stock would be doing very well. But when you add the climate change signal in, we get to where we know we are, which is not a very good place at all. I'll talk about the implications of this kind of work in a second, but As you can see on the slide, there's not many that are not either red or orange, and that creates real challenges in terms of our management and policy environment. Next one, please. So moving into, so I said we've been through that sort of discovery phase. Now we're going through an adaptation phase, and so we're really asking the question about, okay, so we understand that there are species that are more and less sensitive to a changing marine environment. What does that mean for our decision making? At the moment, that's a really qualitative discussion. So we look at those report cards, for example, and we say, all right, okay, this is a species that we know is very sensitive, so we need to take that into account. What we want to do is move to a far more quantitative. I doubt it will ever be fully quantitative, but a far more quantitative way of building those considerations in. So what is, and this risk matrix is something that we're trialling at the moment. And so on the vertical axis is how sensitive is the stock to climate change, and on the horizontal axis is what's its status in terms of the stock assessment. And so, things that are more vulnerable to climate change and in worse shape, we need to be most precautionary on. Things that are less sensitive or in better shape, we can sort of continue business as usual. So this is our attempt, working with colleagues from the US, Canada, Japan, to start building more climate-ready decision points. But I think if I can go to the next slide, please. That risk framework that I'm talking about and that adaptation phase responds to our current policy environment. And our current policy environment says that fisheries management decisions are responsible for ensuring that all fish stocks are sustainable, and all fish stocks are not only sustainable but maintained at very, very high levels compared to virgin biomass. That's creating some real issues for us when you think back to some of those graphs that show that some of these stocks are going to be in real trouble as a result of climate as opposed to as a result of fishing. And so if fishing is not driving the problem, it's very difficult to anticipate how fishing can fix the problem. So as I say, I wanted to leave my quick presentation with two sort of open-ended questions. The first one's about jurisdiction. I loved the cartoon on Greta's presentation about the fish swimming into a new area. And that's exactly what we've got. We've got a ridiculously complex jurisdictional arrangement for Australian fisheries. There are 8 fisheries management agencies. There's the Commonwealth and all the states and Northern Territory. And we have rather innovative for their time, but inflexible now, arrangements between each of us as to who's going to manage what fish in what area using what fishing method. And all of those norms are being challenged at the moment by the shift in fish distribution and the shift in the way that the industry is going to have to operate to exploit those fish. So how do we get something better than what we've got at the moment, which is those offshore constitutional settlements? The second one is the issue that I was talking about before. If we have, and we do, a growing body of evidence that there are non-fisheries impacts that are driving declines or stagnation or not rebuilding of fish stocks, what level of management action is the appropriate level of fisheries management action is the appropriate level to respond to that? And not to put too fine a point on it, but this comes down to risk appetite, and it comes down to what is our long-term vision for the wild catch sector in Australian fisheries? Because a continuation of the current policy frameworks will result in further and further reductions to fisheries on many of those species that were circled in red and orange, and that's just obviously a subset of all the species that we're managing. So how do we have that rational debate? And it's a very scary one to have about what is an acceptable level of decline of a stock that's impacted by climate change, and what's the role of fisheries management decision making to address that or not to address that. So thanks very much, Patrick. I'll leave you with those questions. And Patrick did say on the online platform that you should put in questions and answers. I think the answers are the really important bit. So thanks.
always a problem when you tell people to challenge you and then maybe they go over the challenge line. Thanks, Wes. Certainly setting the scene for a good panel discussion. I'd now like to introduce Sam Gordon. I've known Sam for a long time. Sam is many things. He's got in his bio that he's both the South Coast Mariculture Managing Director and Executive Director of Blue Harvest, but today he's talking as a mussel farmer. Go, Sam. Thanks, Patrick.
Thanks, Patrick, and thanks, ABARE, for the invitation to come and talk. I'm the token aquaculturalist because I happen to live closest to Canberra, so I get drawn into these events. Just a bit of background about myself and Blue Harvest Group. We're involved in mussels, farmed prawns and oysters, and as Patrick touched on, really here to talk about the mussel farm that we've been developing in Jervis Bay and Eden in recent years. It's a new farm. We've started from scratch. We're privileged enough to operate within a marine park, and that brings its own challenges. We also share the marine park with the Navy, and they're in charge of everything. I'm going to start on a positive note here in the sense that climate change has been a huge problem for us firsthand. And I'll just give you a bit of an example. In 2022, we were shut because of rainfall for 24 weeks of the year. Now, the mussels are happy. They're sitting out there. They don't mind the rain. They keep growing. But we weren't able to harvest for 24 weeks of the year. And we've got 20 processing staff, and we're supplying to Coles and Woolies, Harris Farms, and the wholesale market. So trying to manage processing staff that when you're open one week, you're shut the next week, you're open one week, you're shut the next week, and trying to explain that to the major retailers who have gone with you because you're close to market is a real challenge. And that directly relates to climate change, in my opinion, because I looked back through the business plan that we developed when deciding to set up the farm. I didn't even identify rainfall closures as a risk. I identified that the long-term average rainfall closures in Jervis Bay was 6 days per year. So had I even tried to predict it, it would have been in the last 4 to 5 percentile chance of being closed for 24 weeks of the year, and you can't manage for that. So we really are going into uncharted territory here. But I'm an optimist. You have to be when you're involved in business. And I come back to the problem that we need to produce more protein and we need to produce more omega-3. And to put that in sense, we need to produce more protein and omega-3 between now and 2050 than humanity's produced to this point in history. So we need to grow our protein supply by 70%. And we're really well positioned to do that. We need, just to follow on that, we need to grow more protein and more omega-3 between now and 2050 without using more arable land, without using more fresh water, without using more phosphate fertilisers, and without adding to greenhouse gases. So it's a really significant problem. So why are we so well positioned? If we can go to the next slide, please. I'm talking shellfish here, but I could also be talking prawns and then you'll see in the next slide, even fish like salmonids compared to other land-based protein sources. We're really well positioned. If I challenge the room here to Google world's most sustainable foods, mussels will come up in the top 10, unless the algorithms make a liar out of me today. So basically, they are one of the few foods that actually enhances the environment. We filter the nutrients out of the environment and we increase the marine biomass by 1.7 times around our leases. And what that means in real terms is when people go diving in Jervis Bay, the recreational divers, they go diving on our lease because there's a lot more to see on our marine leases than anywhere else in the water column. And we're actually removing nutrients from the environment. So we're actually being a net benefit to the marine park that we operate in. So if we just go to the next slide, please. You can see just how I suppose, special our category is. So in a way, I feel like we should all be singing from the rafters that we have a real solution for aquaculture or for feeding the world. And the reason I bring up omega-3 before is that we all have an ageing population. 75% of the world's omega-3 at the moment comes from wild-caught fish. A lot of that omega-3 then is fed into farmed fish. So there's a finite supply of wild-caught fish to feed this growing need for omega-3. And mussels and other shellfish are full of omega-3. So if you go into a chemist shop at the moment, you're likely to see omega-3 that's been sourced from green shell mussels. So right now, we don't see ourselves as a mussel producer as such as selling live mussels. That's a finite market. We can't grow that market too much as I'd like everyone to be eating live mussels. But we can help feed the world on sustainably caught protein and omega-3. Now, the challenge is we need to scale up. And we'd like to go into offshore waters. The technology's now there to grow 500 hectare, 1,000 hectare, 10,000 hectare farms offshore. The technology exists. We've got a marine drill that can drill in 80 metres depth of water. The challenge for us is government regulation because we're going into an area that's uncharted. We can just go to the next slide, please. So just quickly, the challenge for us before we go there is also how to get these dollars. The BDO has worked out that our industry is worth $1.6 million just in mussels alone in New South Wales with taking nitrogen removal out of the environment. Unfortunately, we're not seeing any of those funds in our bank account. But there is a net benefit. I mean, this kind of information is really important, and I'm really congratulate New South Wales DPI for doing this data with BDO because it does help us make our arguments back to whether it's state governments or the Commonwealth Government in what how valuable our industry is to climate change. But if we go, into the next slide, I suppose this is where I talk about government because I see government barriers to us as the biggest challenge. We're in a race against time. Climate change is real. One of the biggest issues is that I remember meeting an oyster farmer from France in Singapore last year, and he can grow a Pacific oyster, a tropical prawn in a pond with a cold water Pacific oyster. And I asked him how he could do that, and he said the reason we can do it is we put the Pacific oyster in the water during winter, and then as long as the water temperature goes up gradually, that Pacific oyster can live aside with a tropical oyster. The risk to us is the speed of change. Port Stephens lost a lot of their oysters about a year ago because there was a temperature spike. It wasn't a temperature spike over 4 months or 6 months, it was a temperature spike over days. And that's the biggest threat. It's the biggest threat with underlying disease, when you can have diseases that are in the background of the background environment, but when the animals get stressed is when you start losing stock. And so it's those fast temperature changes that really scare us. And it's again, it's the changing currents. We don't know how this is going to affect our industry. So when I go onto the CSIRO and Bureau of Meteorology updates about climate change and what's happening about the next heat wave, our knowledge of how that impacts our marine environment where we operate is really small. I don't know, for example, if that marine heat wave that comes through at winter is going to mean that we don't have any spatfall in Eden that we rely to seed our lines for the next season. Let alone all the other species and the microalgae that our mussels are feeding on. So this is going to be a big change and big challenge for our industry going forward. And I'm really worried personally that the state governments and Commonwealth governments just don't have the means to keep up with legislation as industry has to run ahead to meet this challenge. Thank you.
Certainly getting the brief about challenging us. And now the final speaker is Martin Exel, who's going to appear from sunny Hobart. And I can see him there. G'day, Martin. Martin Exel, Managing Director of CBOS. I'll let Martin explain anything he likes about CBOS. And Martin, you've got time now. Go for it.
Good morning, Patrick, and good morning, everybody. My deep apologies for not being there, but at least I've saved on some greenhouse gas emissions by not travelling, I suppose. This morning, Greta, she's already highlighted that the stark challenges that we face as a planet. Wes then looked and did a great job at explaining some of those massive policy challenges that we face. Sam with the both solution and challenge that we're looking at from the industry sector. And so today, what I thought I'd do very quickly is look at some of the international solutions, if you like, and some of the more positive sides of things. So if I could have that first slide. And this is the high-level panel for a sustainable ocean economy, so that the 18 heads of state globally, and the Australian Prime Minister, of course, is one of those. And their most recent updates identified that the ocean can actually provide solutions with technology that exists now, as Sam talked about, to reduce those greenhouse gas emissions by 30 to 35%. Now, a caveat on that is it's not all in the seafood sector, obviously. 20, maybe 25% is oil and gas reductions and changes, but it's a great start. From the seafood sector perspective, if I could have the next slide, it means three really kind of simple things. So there's a lot of words there, but the first is emissions reductions through rebuilding depleted wild stocks, i.e. make the fish easier to catch, ensure there are more of them in the water. And of course, again, as Wes mentioned, that's really challenging when climate's impacting the stocks, but that's the goal, is get all of that fishery management in place, get all of the ecosystem management in place so that not just seafood, but blue foods generally can be well managed. Reducing emissions from aquaculture. Most of the aquaculture emissions come from feed and electricity. So looking at that side of things, but also the impact when you're producing feed of deforestation. And there's an awful lot being done on that. Thirdly, is the increase and the consumer change in dietary preference or dietary choice, and looking for low carbon alternatives, be that fin fish, shellfish, blue food, seaweed, is going to be, again, a crucial part of the move forward that we all have. Next slide, please. We have a task force in CBOS, which is driven, or in fact, the name of it is the Task Force on Climate Resilience. And CBOS, for those who don't know, is a collaboration between 9 of the largest seafood corporations of the world at CEO level, and then science from Stockholm, Lancaster, Stanford, and Tokyo. And the idea is for those corporations to work with the science and create a global transformation towards sustainable seafood production and a healthy ocean. And the way they're going to do that is by actually making changes in their own multinational corporations. And because they represent somewhere around 20% of the global production of seafood, if they make the shift, others will follow. Now, that's the theory anyway, that's what we hope. So the task force, which is driven by the CSR executives and the science teams, set some goals in 2020 just to identify science-based goals and reporting, to actually publicise those goals from each of the corporations, to implement their Scope 3 emission and resilience transfer actions, and to start raising awareness of the benefits of dietary shifts. It didn't take very long to identify that we weren't all talking the same language, and that there was a clear need for a standardised outline and a process for quantifying and reporting on greenhouse gas emissions. But if I go to the next slide, this is reality. So we're not 100% perfect. That's a good thing, actually, because it means that we can learn and we can improve. But and this is as at 2023, all of them had set science-based targets to reduce their emissions. All of them had reported on Scope 1 and 2 emissions publicly, and 7 of the 9 had reported on their Scope 3 emissions publicly. 5 of the 9 actually went the next step and have joined up to the Science Based Targets Initiative, which is creating that standardised reporting, hopefully, and mechanisms that can be used by corporations to improve and reduce their greenhouse gas emissions along the way. But if I go to the next slide, one of the challenges we have is that our climate actions as corporations and as individuals aren't actually aligned. So this is a quick survey we did of who's doing what. And I don't expect you to look at all of it, but if you see there's 5 of the 9 are improving vessel catch per unit effort / fuel efficiency. What does that mean? That means 5 of the 9 are looking at improving the sustainability of the fisheries they operate in, but also looking at changes to the vessel design, fuel use, etc. Electrification of infrastructure, that's the aquaculture group, and then blue carbon restoration. Many of them have been working in blue carbon restoration and still don't actually know where to report this properly, because they're looking both at biodiversity and greenhouse gas emissions reduction and social benefits. So interesting. One thing that really surprised us is that 9 of the 9 are working on eliminating coal from Scope 1 emissions. And that's worth thinking about. If I just say that there's so many other things to talk about, but the main points I really wanted to get across, and you can kill that slide if you like, were 4. One is the need for consistent global standards to report on those greenhouse gas emissions reductions. So get something that everyone understands. So we're comparing apples with apples. We need to take account of biodiversity impacts as well as greenhouse gas emissions. And if we look at the recent moves in social areas, that's going to be critical as well. So I'm drawing attention to the Task Force on Nature-related Financial Disclosure, the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive that's happening in the EU. And we can talk more about those later maybe. Third, we need to acknowledge the challenge for industry and all sectors to shift without government leadership and without clear guidelines and sort of structures that encourage the shift to climate-friendly, low greenhouse gas emission production. And then last, I think we all need to recognise that as individuals and companies, the seafood sector are super well placed to make a positive difference. And that helps when we also bring the consumers along with us, which means it's a holistic thing so that consumers start looking at, well, I'm going to make a climate positive choice and eat low carbon foods. And we as an industry and a seafood sector most broadly need to start delivering truly sustainable, truly biodiverse and truly socially acceptable seafood to the customer. So thank you very much. And again, I do apologise for not being there. There's nothing worse than seeing this big head on a screen. But anyway, that's enough for me. Thanks, Patrick.
Thanks, Mark. Thank you, Martin. So I might just call the panel up, and while they're coming up, we're on the Q&A, just reminding people if they put questions into the Q&A, we will take questions from the audience as well, so you don't have to use the app. I'm going to just do 2 pictures while they're coming up. One is to tell everyone that yesterday with the Department of Industry, Science and Research, we announced the BR initiative, which is a $1 million+ challenge for anybody who can reduce energy costs in fishing, so 30% reduction in energy use in fishing and there's $1 million plus prize for the person who can come up with those innovations. So go on to the BRII website, Business Research in Innovation Industry. I think I got it right, the BRII. Anyway, it's on our side as well. And the other one, I just want to acknowledge Larissa Taylor in the audience. Martin talked about the TNFD work, the Task Force for Nature Financial Derivatives. At the end of the day, we still need to have world-accepted practice on this. So, getting the right standards, and that was a big pitch of Martin's, getting those right standards, you can't go it alone. We all have to work together globally. So, any questions from the audience while you're thinking about it? I might just start. So, Sam, mussel farming. You talked about a bigger horizon, 10,000, whatever. Why is moving aquaculture into Commonwealth waters a good idea from a climate perspective, and what's the challenge for you?
Thanks, Patrick. Well, look, it's really an access to space. So the state lines finish two nautical miles out. And so if you want to think big, you want to have the options to be able to go into Commonwealth waters as well as state waters, not be confined. Because how it'll work is they're going to have to overlay shipping routes, whale migration routes, suitable substrates, commercial fishing access, etc., etc. So once you put the overlays of all those other competing interests over, you might find that the available space is in Commonwealth waters, not state waters. The challenge with that is that there's no existing regulations to do that. So at least with state waters, there's some form of existing regulations and some form of roadmap, albeit complex and expensive. And to give you an idea of expense, it would cost us $500,000 just to put an application in. That's not even to put a test line in, that's just to put an application in New South Wales. There's not even a guarantee that you could actually make it work. But in Commonwealth waters, there's no roadmap, to my knowledge. So it's just how long would that take? And would the investors have the patience to wait for the Commonwealth to develop a policy? Probably not.
Any still looking? I'm not seeing any questions on the things, so just letting the people at the back, if anybody's got any questions on the Q&A. Greta, so the Blue Economy CRC is working on the future of platforms for aquaculture, and they're talking very much, and I think the holy grail is if you move out into deep oceanic waters, you're more buffered by climate change. Is that a reality?
I suspect they'd be more buffered than inshore, but there still can be quite large changes in temperature and extreme events, but I think there would be much less susceptible inshore, but still challenges for sure, yeah.
Still waiting. Question up the back, yep.
Yeah, thanks, Patrick. So
just announce who you are.
Oh, sorry, Dave Galliano.
The online audience.
Dave Galliano, ABARES. Question about the sort of social acceptability of the climate impacts. So we've got this challenge, of course, that climate's having an impact on some fish stocks. We've got the context here of what's happening in native forestry with Victoria, WA, Queensland getting out of native harvest due to, supposed unacceptable environmental impacts. I'm just wondering on how we get past that social acceptability of these impacts on fish stocks and saying, oh, well, yep, there was past overfishing, there's climate impacts on them now, they're never coming back. I worry that there's going to be a big blocker there in society about saying, yeah, that's okay. For both industry and managers and the research sector, I just wonder how we grapple with that challenge, because it's not going to be easy.
Greta.
Yeah, well, welcome to my life. I think, there's definitely no simple solution for that, but the societal expectations for what we're going to experience in the future, I think, are something that we have to address across the board. No matter what sector or industry you're in, we are in for some unpredictable times, some massive shocks. And in fact, one of the concerns that was highlighted in the Australasian chapter for IPCC was that we're really not set up as a society for managing everybody through a known decline and such a massive change at a whole of society level, and that in terms of social acceptability of impacts and the responses to those impacts, everybody has a different level of risk appetite, as was highlighted, and the level of understanding of exactly what's going to happen in the future, I think, is not as widely recognised as we would like. And then you have all of those psychological things that we all do to distance ourselves from the impacts. So things like cognitive dissonance, we actively ignore some of these problems because they are so overwhelming. So one of the things that we're trying to do in the Centre for Marine Socioecology is partner with psychologists and social scientists and really try and tackle those human elements quite head on, and they're definitely not easy. We're talking about things like behaviour change, which is not easy at a societal level. One thing that I think we could certainly be doing to a much better extent, and I think Martin might have hinted at this, is creating those shared visions of what is possible, and that mobilising narrative of sure, impacts are quite bad, the future's looking vulnerable. However, it is in our capacity to drive some of that change. Change is going to happen whether we respond to that constructively or not. So we can either be on the front foot, or we can just be at the mercy of whatever happens to us. And I think if we can help create that shared vision of what is actually technically possible, then that creates a lot more impetus for moving towards that. But I don't think that answered your question, but it's definitely a big challenge around those shifting baselines too that people have. Yeah.
So we've now got two questions online. I'll let some people think about the first one, but we'll start the other one first. So one question is, are low-carbon foods nutritionally equivalent, and has sustained human health impact been assessed? And it was quite noticeable yesterday that when Marion Jansen was talking from the OECD, she talked not about food security but also nutrition security. So I think that's to that. So we'll come to that. But the first question is to you, Sam. What is your biggest government barrier?
I have to deal with 13 different government departments. Some of those within departments, so you might have within the Department of New South Wales Primary Industry, you might have biosecurity, marine parks, the Shellfish Food Authority, Department of Fisheries, and then outside DPI too, and across levels, Commonwealth with the Navy, and then state government. And then you've got between state governments, so biosecurity in New South Wales, talking to biosecurity in Victoria, talking to biosecurity in Queensland. They don't tend to actually talk. If one says yes, the other says no. So those challenges. But the biggest challenge for me is conflict of regulation. So I'll give you a practical example. One of the ways we can mitigate against climate change is to have breeding programs for mussels to build resilience, or it could be prawns, any species, but to have breeding programs to build in resilience to temperature shocks or any other quick change. There's conflict. So if I went to the marine parks and said I want to develop a breeding program, they'd find that really challenging. The idea of taking an endemic species and introducing it into a breeding program wouldn't fit their regulatory requirements, but it'd be supported by the Department of Primary Industry Fisheries Department, because it is seen as a way of mitigating against climate change. So there's those conflicts within departments.
Thank you. So does anyone have a go at that nutrition question? So are healthy seafoods? Martin, you're going to have a go. Thanks, Martin.
I think that's a great question, and I would point whoever it came from to the Blue Foods assessment work that was done in 2021 and 2022, where absolutely that was what was done. It was comparing, what are the advantages and disadvantages of blue foods and the utility of not just the low carbon production of blue foods, but also the nutrients, the various minerals and everything else, the omega-3s, as Sam mentioned. And the incorporation of that blue food assessment results that were global. There was a group of scientists, I think 60 or 80 of them, that did the 5 papers into the United Nations Food Systems Summit. And it's the first time in 2023 when blue foods were even recognised as a food. So, again, there is that positive hope. It's like we need to promote the blue food benefits. We need to promote the nutrient and the mineral and omega-3, etc. benefits. And we need to promote the opportunities that it can create by improving our biodiversity and improving our fisheries and agriculture programs. Thank you.
Yeah, and it's just worth noting, until recently, people didn't even acknowledge that 2.5 billion people rely on blue foods for their livelihoods. And it's an incredibly important industry, particularly in developing countries. I'm just looking for around the audience. We do have many more questions. They're all coming to you, Sam. So Sam, as a small to medium enterprise, how do you think ESG as a compliance or risk management is anywhere currently asking you to report your greenhouse emission data for ESG reporting? So what sort of, as a company, to what degree are you being asked to report on greenhouse gas?
Not much yet, but it's coming. So it's a bit like the way I look at it. I remember old enough to remember when HACCP was a basic core, basic get past go. And then about 10 years ago, the major retailers pulled us all into a room as suppliers and said you had to have sustainability programs in place, and you couldn't think of supplying to a major retailer now without having a sustainability program, like in our case BAP, Best Aquaculture Practice, but it could be Aquaculture Stewardship Council. So if you don't have those now, you're not supplying into the major retailers, and the reality is that they supply about 70% of Australia's seafood goes through the major retailers, whether we like it or not. So I just see it as another continuation of that process. We're not being asked at this stage to meet it, but I'm sure in the future we will be. And so it's something that a medium-sized company like ours needs to start planning for.
So we've got 8 minutes, and we did get a really good question, and I'm going to get each of the panellists to answer it. So we'll go and we'll start with Greta, and then Wes, then Sam, then you, Martin. So we'll just go in the same order again. So it's a good question, and it comes to the heart of what we're talking. It's a positive question. So, we've talked about the regulatory environment, the policy. We've talked about the time lag and the phases. But what can we do positively as government and industry and other sectors to collaborate to change this? How can we be more forward-thinking? So what are the positive things we can do? Martin touched on a few things, but what are the positive things we can do, either business to business, government to business, within different sectors? So what are the positive things we can do? I'm re-paraphrasing the anonymous question. That's right. Yeah, but it's a good question. So we might start with you, Grace. We're looking for a positive end today. What can we do in that collaboration space to make a difference and do things differently?
Okay, well, it kind of relates a little bit to those social licence, social acceptability questions earlier. And one thing that I'm constantly surprised by is the public perception that Australian seafood is not well managed, that it's damaging the environment, that, most things are overfished. And people will even say to me, I'll go and buy, imported prawns or whatever because Australian seafood is not well managed, and it really flabbergasts me. So I kind of wish that we had a bit more of a collaborative campaign that really highlighted the accurate, a more accurate perception in the public around, or fostered a more accurate perception in the public around exactly how well managed Australian seafood is, what the climate benefits can be, how they can be sustainable choices, and how well on a global scale that our sector's doing, so that people, aren't comparing it to other imports where there's issues like slave labour and illegal fishing and some things like that, so that we had more public support for really helping drive change and support our seafood sector.
Wes?
All right, thanks very much. I'll try and make 3 points really quickly. The first one, similar to that, but it's about getting it right where we can get it right. So in that panel of graphs that I put up, the positive news is that the ones that weren't in orange and red are the major target species. So for that particular fishery at least, flathead, blue grenadier, orange roughy, gummy shark were all there as stocks that we should be able to control because they have a low sensitivity to climate change. They're all doing relatively well, and they're responsible for the bulk of the production in that fishery. So getting it right where we can get it right is obviously supporting a sustainable and profitable fishing industry. The second one is working, as Sam says, working with the retailers. The retailers depends on the day of the week whether I think that they are responding to public interest and demand, or whether they're actually driving public interest and demand for sustainable fish. But either way, building better relationships with them, and we work very closely with some of them to tell that story about, yes, this is sustainable, here are the issues with it, but this is what's being done about them. And then the third one is about reviewing our risk framework for the management of fisheries. In typical government fashion, and Sam mentioned this before, we've got lots of government departments doing lots of things. We've got marine parks, we've got areas that may or may not be set aside for offshore wind production. We've got fisheries closures. We need to have a holistic look at that and say, do we need all of those? Or now that this area, there's going to be a reduced fishing footprint in this area because of a marine park or an offshore aquaculture precinct, do we still need that fishery closure that's next door, or is that going to accommodate our risk for us and we can remove that? Because it's that kind of tailoring of our regulatory footprint to the actual risk posed by the industry that will result in it being able to continue to operate.
Sam?
Well, I remain incredibly optimistic from the point being that we don't have a choice. We have to grow more protein and we have to produce more omega-3 and others. So that's the starting point for me, is that otherwise we're going to have starvation. Not so much in Australia, but around the world. And so that's unacceptable. So we have to be positive. I suppose for me, the most positive, and I've been on this bandwagon for a long time, I'm a farmer. I just happen to farm in the ocean. So I have a lot more, I feel a lot more aligned with the Department of Agriculture than the Department of Fisheries, to be honest. The Department of Fisheries is about compliance, compliance of recreational fishing, compliance of commercial fishing, compliance of other stakeholders. Agriculture is about growth and supporting growth in a sustainable manner. And my big boat's just a big tractor. My mussel lines are underwater vineyards. And so I suppose I would like to see recognition for aquaculture sector as part of the Australian agriculture industry as a whole.
Martin?
So to answer the question of what can we do, they've all covered everything, but I would suggest high-level dialogue and focus, so like a process for government, industry, NGOs, civil society, driven by science to get together and identify what are the key risks. So do like a big risk assessment and risk analysis. Choose the one or two that are the big ones we want to focus on, identify actions and timelines, and then have a monitoring and reporting feedback loop to deliver those outcomes. So actually drive the process through, perhaps it's a Australian government program where you bring together some of the top industry players with the top science from climate, as well as our chief scientist, and actually agree on this is the scientific underpinning of it, but then drive that focus and drive that reporting and monitoring in a way that actually allows us to see where we are making positive change and where we are actually getting towards that end goal.
Thanks, Martin. So just drawing to a conclusion, so just a couple of things from the chair from me. So first of all, just a big thank you for ABARES for acknowledging that this is a really important policy conversation that we need to have. So, hats off to the ABARES team for that. Second one, and just to acknowledge that it's a partnership. That last question was about partnership. And somehow we need to make that partnership work even better than we've done past. So we have amazing scientists, we have amazing people in industry, in conservation groups and others. We need to find better ways to work together. Third one is you're only as good as how you measure it, and I acknowledge Sam Brown in the audience from Agriculture Innovation Australia. We do need standardised reporting methods that stack world best so they can actually step up, because industry will want to know, and other people, how we're actually performing. Lastly, it's a complex problem. It's a really wicked problem. Doing the things we've done in the past, as Wes said, is not going to get us there. So we really are going to challenge ourselves to how we do this differently, not just better, because it is a complex problem. It will need different ways to think about how we solve this problem. And it's not just an Australian problem. So it was great to have Martin here from CBOS, because we're not alone. We're not the only ones trying to solve this. So the question is, how do we all work together? And then, lastly, from an FRDC's perspective, we absolutely love the seafood and aquatic industries. Our big goal is to have healthy aquatic environments. That's what we all want. And from that, we produce healthy and aquatic foods. We think that's a really good equation. And we really acknowledge all the work that everyone does to make that a possibility. So with that, I finish. We're 1 minute over. We'll still be here for questions afterwards, but thank you very much for coming today, both the online audience, wherever you are, and those who've attended today in person. It was just fantastic. So thank you very much.